Right. So we're back with part two of today's series. Part two of a 3-day event, the Digital Free Market Roadshow. Before we get into the to our second speaker, just once again like to mention to give thanks actually to our co-organizers, obviously the Free Market Roadshow and the Romanian American University, as well as our local partners. Coming now with a very interesting topic. Dr. Calum Nicholson, British writer, academic, and also correspondent for the Economic Standard. Dr. Calum will be speaking to us today on the issue of COVID-19 and how this is actually the apocalypse in some sense of the word. Dr. Calum, if you can help us with this a little bit in more detail.
The invitation to
all right, there we go. Yeah.
Right.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. So my talk today is entitled COVID-19 presents us with an apocalypse, but in the original sense of the word. So I'll just get straight into it. So, I mean, there's been much talk recently about COVID-19 constituting a societal cataclysm, a sort of viral apocalypse that's devastating to life and livelihoods across the planet. And the pandemic is, of course, real. People are, of course, dying. It is, of course, a tragedy. But is it an apocalypse? And I would say that it is, but not in the sense that we understand the word today. What many people don't, I think, know is that the word apocalypse, in fact, has two different meanings. There's the modern usage, which is in terms of cataclysm, but there's the original usage, which meant the revelation of what has previously been concealed. And in this sense, I think we can absolutely argue that the current crisis is quite apocalyptic. It's a crisis that is revealing much that has remained concealed, albeit sometimes in plain sight. So indeed, if often it in fact takes a crisis to help us realize which of our ideas and orthodoxies are in fact fair weather ideas and hardly fit for the purpose of aiding us in society when we face up to or try and face down our collective problems and challenges. So what I'd like to now do is sketch out a number of flaws this crisis, I think, is revealed in what I'd loosely term our culture and our values. Specifically, what ways and forms of thinking the crisis has exposed as perhaps less constitutive of the solutions we need, but rather part of the problems we face. And the purpose of this will be to help us consider how we might approach revising our thinking and our culture once this crisis has passed, and how we can best plan to think, be it as individuals or as a society, in its wake. How can we think so that in future we are less vulnerable to such crises, but also more able to organize ourselves to confront them? So I'm going to really run through 4 points. So the first point is the danger of assuming that all our problems are fundamentally objective and scientific ones. I've been struck in the last couple of months by how relatively few voices there have been questioning the dominant narrative about the nature of a necessary response to the pandemic. It's mainly been left to provocateurs and right-wing writers to do so. And I think this is quite bad for the public discourse. It has politicized what should have been an apolitical debate about the approaches we're taking to dealing with the crisis. The problem is that much of the popular consensus on this issue is based on an assumption that the science is monolithic, but it is not. There are few areas of science that are so conclusive that there is no room for questioning. Even in fundamental physics, as anyone knows, with relativity and quantum mechanics, both valid theories, but they're irreconcilable. Doesn't mean one is wrong and one is right. It just means they're irreconcilable. There is room for debate. There are still questions. And the same applies down when you get down to the softer end of the hard sciences, when you're talking about statistical modeling. There are many models when it comes to modeling epidemics, and they all have their subjectively selected and defined inputs. And there are as many of these as there are epidemiologists almost. Scientists themselves know this. Their fields are indeed built on the creative tension of this aspective diversity. But somehow, in the popular mind, science remains this monolithic thing, and it just is not. And so there is a lot to be questioned in this current crisis, not just about which model is used, but also with regard to the balance between a concern for public health and a concern for every other part that makes up the societal whole. There is also, I think, a great need to question, given we have triggered perhaps the greatest self-induced economic self-immolation in history. Privately, in my experience, many people articulate doubts about the lockdown policies that have been adopted and how judicious they were. But there is, I think, a relative silence on the issue in the public domain. I think probably because people fear censure, they fear appearing callous, they fear being labeled as some sort of nut or a fascist or stupid or selfish or morally sordid. Because I think death in huge numbers, of course, is the thing at issue. And it is a taboo to challenge any public consensus when we have the topic of death involved. And I'll come back to that later. But to be clear, of course, excessive deaths are terrible. And of course, we should do what we can to protect people. I mean, I myself have been very frustrated that my own parents keep acting like it's 2002, not 2020, in trying to deal with this, in trying to get them to stay home. But the strange thing is, once you look into what makes up the numbers, the thing issue in terms of the pandemic begins to dissolve somewhat. And with it, the justification, at the very least, I think, for crashing life as we know it. And here's 2 points to illustrate what I mean. First of all, the actual cases of infection, by the admission of the UK's chief scientific officer, are 10 to 20 times the recorded cases. This means the ratio of deaths relative to infections is probably much lower than is publicly assumed based on the testing. But secondly, in the UK at least, recorded COVID-19 deaths are those not who died necessarily from the virus, but those who died with the virus. So it includes people who died with it as a primary cause, a contributory cause, and cases where they had COVID, but their death was unrelated to it. And so likely the numbers there have overestimated the deaths. So if you put together the number of infections have been wildly underestimated and the number of deaths have been overestimated, then it's hard not to at least begin questioning the wisdom of locking down everything. Is the cure worse than the disease? Becomes not only a valid question, but I think an existentially necessary one, and a necessary one for a civil society to be able to debate openly without fear of censure. I think because if being infected is far, far less dangerous than the official data suggests, and if there are far fewer attributable deaths in the context of it, we really do need to ask, is destroying all of our livelihoods worth it? And look, life, of course, matters, but we have a very narrow view of what constitutes life if we only measure it quantitatively and in the short term. So if a 79-year-old passes today in the context of this virus, it means that they lose 2 years of retired life relative to the national average life expectancy, which in the UK is 80.96. But the measures to reduce their risk on average, the measures we're taking to reduce their risk, the prolonged lockdown, will categorically reduce the quality of life in the long term for several generations behind them. And this will almost inevitably reduce their average life expectancy, which, by the way, has already stalled. As I saw one person write recently, this is not a case of life versus the economy. This is life versus life. The debate here is not between the forces of morality and venality. It is between different but equally important and valid understandings of what the grounds for moral action is. In short, we realize that there is more to these problems than merely the objective epidemiological facts, to the extent to which you can be objective about the epidemiological facts. There are also questions of value, which are subjective and which demand debate, not a polite consensus. So this is the first lesson, I think, from this crisis, that science is a tool, not a guide. It can serve our politics and subjective values, but it cannot dictate or reveal what our values should be. Over the last few decades, we've seen the steady encroachment of what's known as scientism throughout the culture of the West. That is the presumption that science isn't just a method or tool, but a philosophy and an ethics in and of itself. And above all else, I think this crisis and its aftermath should reveal the need to rejuvenate our faith in philosophy, of keeping an eye on context, on the bigger picture, on the whole subjective organism of society, rather than simply its more objective and mechanical parts, such as public health in isolation. So we constantly hear the lament that people and politicians are ignorant of science these days. Everyone's always saying our politicians, they're all humanities students who go on to politics. They're ignorant of the science. But for the most part, this is true, of course. But it's hardly more surprising than that most people are frankly ignorant of most areas of law, and hardly more problematic. Science and law are both specialized areas of knowledge, and in their devilish detail, they're actually rather dry. Why would, and indeed why should, people keep up with it all? How indeed could they? what seems to be much more consequential than ignorance of particular scientific facts, because bear in mind that the last polymath died in the 18th century, the person who knew everything. The more consequential in having ignorance of the scientific facts is having far too much, I think, reverence for science, in the sense of assuming it is monolithic and alone able to access the truth. And both of these assumptions, I think, are just as toxic as not knowing a particular fact. And I suspect we'll look back at this as a time when we realize the hard way that there is a difference between society being served by science and being in the thrall of technocratic scientism. And in this, I think there are parallels with the public discussion around climate change, by the way. Both are seen as existential threats that require us to completely upend our societies or risk mass mortality. And both become less clear and the core concepts more problematic when you examine them. Indeed, we seem to have now entered an age where the new hysterias and irrationalisms are not dissolved by science, but fueled by a blind faith that science holds all the answers. Scientism, not science, but scientism seems to be the new faith. And it's Old Testament faith. It's all fire, brimstone, plagues, and judgment. But science is a tool, not an answer. And I think we need to use it wisely. And if we don't, we risk using it, which is our greatest achievement, as a justification for our manias at the cost of the thing that is most hard won, but also, I think, often taken for granted, which is the rhythm of our normality. And after this crisis, hopefully, we can continue to respect science, but cease to act with the breathless deference and reductivism that has been a growing trend over the last few decades, the cost of which I think is being revealed by this crisis. So that's my first point. The second point is really linked to the first, and it's the need to escape the assumption that our society is or is trending inexorably towards a rational order, which is also a just one. For decades in the West, we've seen, as I've already mentioned, the expansion of the spirit of science into all things. So it's now become normal to talk about optimizing oneself, for instance, tracked by apps, which are driven by big data. So have we eaten the right amount? Have we slept sufficiently? Have we walked enough? Have we kept our tone at the right modulation? Once these questions, if they occurred at all, were answered intuitively, now we seek intuitive answers. We turn not to experience, but to what the science and the data tells us. And this logic of denying the emotion and relying on the intellect and received information to justify is evident in almost all areas of life. And perhaps there's no area this is more evident. In no area is there more evident of this sort of blinkered reductivism and two-dimensional view of human life than in our economic order. So for years, we've seen our elites in the North American model of capitalism measure value purely in quantitative terms, with little or no regard for the place or role of business in the community. Indeed, there is a denial of anything outside of a quantitative logic. I mean, Thatcher famously said there was no such thing as society, which typified that. And so for decades, we've seen elites espouse the virtues of a rational order, of moving businesses overseas to save money and damn the social consequences, the impact on communities. It's not personal, they say, it's business. There's no room for emotion in business. We must be rational. And by the way, they also say this may not feel just at the time, but it will in the long term be good. The market will correct. The market will be a rising tide that lifts all boats in time. But for the destitute communities in the provinces of England, where I grew up, and also in the flyover states in the US, it's not clear that time ever has or ever will come. And this is why we're seeing, I think, the opioid epidemics in these areas, because there's a vacuum of meaning and purpose and dignity in the wake of lost industries. However, in the context of this current crisis, something else is evident. The elites who long justified their actions by stating that we must act rationally with self-interest, not emotionally with a sense of community, are now precisely the ones telling us, the general public, largely made up of the underclass of people whose lives have become harder, that they should not act rationally and in self-interest, but emotionally. So they're saying protect lives, not your economy, not your financial interests. And I think what's being revealed here is the conditionality of our supposedly rational order. It's not rational as a consistent philosophy, it's rationality as an ex post facto justification for actions already taken. I don't think this has anything to do with justice. It's a lot to do rather with hypocrisy. And as most people agree, the longer the crash lasts, the more bricks and mortar shops, the more mom and pop shops will close and be wiped out, and the more digital and tech giants will be empowered. And so small and local businesses will implode. But where the big global corporations stumble, they'll probably be bailed out as they're too big to fail, because we all need our local Tesco supermarket. So this is the other thing I think the crisis has revealed apocalyptically, that despite all the assurances to the contrary by those with an interest in these assurances, ours is not and perhaps has never been a rational order. And to the extent it has presented itself as one, this has never been about consistency and justice. It has been about the hypocrisies that come with trying to gain an advantage at another's cost. And I think this is another thing we can learn in the wake of this pandemic and reflect on. The third point is that, as shorter, is with regard to, I think, the inanity of the rhetoric and around in our divided times. So everyone knows in the last half decade we've lived in very polarized times. You know, there's been sort of the neo-nationalists on the right, the Trumps, the Brexits. There's also been the neo-socialists, the neo-Puritans on the left, Sanders and Corbyn. And both sides, you know, we all know they've got a lot of very equivocal language. I mean, get Brexit done, make America great again, these empty figurative terms. But a lot of our language becomes very normalized. And one term that's become very typical of this crisis, and I think comes out of the politics of the last decade, is the phrase that lives matter more than the economy. And we hear this a lot, lives matter more than the economy, put lives before the economy. But the phrase for me implies that we've forgotten exactly what the economy refers to. The economy is not some luxury or affectation or indulgence of the rich. The economy is simply the name we give to the quantitative abstraction of people's lives. It is a phrase that rather crudely tries to approximate, mechanically theorize, and quantitatively value a part of something that is in truth organic, whole, and qualitative, which is the experience of life itself. We must all eat, we must all sleep, we must all find shelter. We work collectively to do this. Part of this collective effort is what we term the economy. Economy has another name, actually, livelihoods. And if you juxtapose lives to economy, that doesn't sound nearly as crazy as lives to livelihoods. And I think the problem here is that when people think of the economy, what they are often actually thinking of is finance. And they remember the venality of the banking crisis in 2008. And all finance, whereas all finance is part of the economy, not all the economy is reducible to finance. And as with so much in our fevered political culture in recent years, I think in the wake of this crisis, we might all do well with reflecting on our rhetoric. For in this case, the mantra lives over the economy, i.e. the paradoxical dismissal of livelihoods in the effort to ensure no life is dismissed, I think is actually quite dangerous, because it is a rhetoric that has led, I think, to a deafening silence on whether livelihoods are, in fact, something we can dismiss or take for granted. I mean, yesterday, the UK announced that the economy is about to shrink 14% this year and unemployment will double to 9%. This is not an abstraction. This is potentially as much of a cataclysm for life as the disease itself, and potentially far more so. So as my final point, and I'll draw to a close, is that my final point is about the systemic cost of a pathologically risk-averse culture. And I want to suggest we might benefit from considering that just maybe we are, in fact, in a historically exceptional period in our attitudes towards death and risk and loss. And maybe in attempting to preserve the belief that's pretty unique to the 20th and 21st century, with the help of science and rationalism, we can control our individual fate. I think we actually risk sealing our collective one as an aspirational society. What cost, tangible or intangible, is in the end acceptable to avoid being confronted by the limits of ourselves as a society and as a moral actors faced with hard choices? Central to this largely undebated debate, in my view, is the debate around the balance between central to this largely undebated debate about the balance between lives and livelihoods is the question of the status of death in our culture. And central to understanding that status, I think, is an understanding of how its status has changed and how historically exceptional our current zero tolerance for mass mortality, in fact, is. Faced with poverty, war, violent crime, the circle of life, disease, mortality has always been a constant concern and preoccupation in the lives of even the wealthiest people until the early 20th century, before sanitation and welfare, before volunteer armies and long-distance ballistics and drones, before Peel's police, before antibiotics and Fleming and modern midwifery, before epidemiology and microbiology. Death was a specter haunting the lives of everyone. It was a part of the very basis of religious faith itself, it being the best defense most people could muster against the vicissitudes of fortune and the ultimate misfortune of death. I don't think it's any coincidence that historically faith has contracted when control over our fate has dilated. But today, our predominantly secular public culture reflects the general belief that we have replaced fate with facts, and a general sense that death has become less a matter of theology and more a matter of technocracy. Whereas in the past, the stories we told were of miraculous survivals against the odds, today the stories we tell are of death against the odds. Whereas once the exception to be explained away was life, Today, the exception to be accounted for is death. Why did it happen? What mistake was made? Who's responsible? And in our technocratic risk-averse culture, we have so systematically inoculated ourselves against risk that death, be it on the road, in the air, at the front, at work, or in the ward, has become a morbid curiosity demanding explanation, that we may identify the error in the cultural code to be corrected so that the death in question is never replicated. But this attitude to death, I'd argue, is the historical exception. It's not the rule. And in this current crisis, it is crucial that we realize our attitudes to it are shaped by the exceptional period we have just lived through since the end of the Second World War. The other day, the 64-year-old Maria Shriver, Arnold Schwarzenegger's former wife and a Kennedy, she recently said that her generation had seen a lot in their lifetimes. But this is only true to a point. The baby boomer generation, those most at risk from this pandemic, have as a cohort seen the most of any generation in human history only because of their lifelong freedom to travel, their access to telecommunications, and the fact that they are probably the longest lived generation in human history. Longer than our generation, or my generation will be probably. But they all have they actually experienced the most? Have they experienced pandemics and wars and cataclysms on par with those that blighted the lives of their ancestors? And I'd argue clearly not. Their attitudes to risk have been frozen by fortune. They've not been forged in fire. And their idealist frame of reference could, I think, have cataclysmic consequences in the current crisis. And I think the othering of death and fetishizing of life in our culture, which has glorified longevity over meaning, has led to the deafening silence in the question of whether we should, in fact, be seeking to mitigate this virus at all costs. The focus as a result has been on how to do this. Governments claim to be science-led in their efforts, a claim that implies there is no discussion of values to be had. But as I've already noted, ultimately, this is a question of values in philosophy and not science. And what we're learning through this crisis are that many of our age's most exceptional values, be it individualism or the rule of the market, are in fact exceptional in a much more prosaic sense. They're revealed as to be fair weather ideas, interesting ideas for easy times, but in interesting times, they are uneasy ones. And perhaps most uneasy of all, I think, is our collective attitude and orthodoxy towards risk. For decades, there's been a gradual and inexorable spread, some would say viral spread, of a risk aversion across the culture. Sector by sector, year by year, the lawyers have shaken their heads and drawn in red ink the circle of acceptability much tighter. So in an attempt to limit the quantity of risk, we've sacrificed a great deal of quality of experience. As the paperwork has grown, and as the concept of liability has entered into the calculus of everything we do, we've seen the dwindling of everything from the school field trip to what is acceptable speech, from the time police, teachers, and doctors can dedicate to their primary duties, to the number of people who can afford to set up a new business, still less make a success of it. And I think in the current crisis, it likely marks the end of this culture of legalistic risk aversion, which has increasingly dominated human society for half a century. As taken to its logical extreme, the culture of risk aversion, I think, is now revealing itself to be one of the greatest risks we face, with its potential cost being the systemic and devastating effect it has on society and the economy, both globally and in the long term. So to finally, to conclude, and I'm very much here now, so to wrap up, there's an old adage in disaster risk reduction, among disaster risk reduction scholars, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. There are hazards, storms, pandemics, and earthquakes, but those may be natural, but disasters themselves are man-made. And the problems I've outlined in this talk were all trends that existed before this crisis, and they've simply had their costs thrown into sharper relief, I think, by this natural hazard of the pandemic. And this apocalyptic revelation is perhaps something that can be leveraged to stimulate a broader reflection on the philosophical norms of our prevailing culture, with a view to changing them. And it would seem to me that not doing so would be the real apocalypse, in the second sense of cataclysm in the long term. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. We do have a few seconds left, and I would very much like to take a comment. One of our questions that we've received. Do you think science will help with future discoveries meant to save people or to control them, from any point of view? If you could share your impressions on this. This is from Alexandra, one of our followers.
Say that again, sorry. Would science...
So do you think science will help with future discoveries meant to save people or to control them?
Well, the thing is,
from any point of view.
Okay, so the crucial thing to recognize with science is it's a tool, and it can be used for good and it can be used for ill. It's just like religion. People say, some people say religion is bad and some people say religion is good. Religion is just religion, and some people use it for good, some people use it for bad. And we are the ones who make the decisions of how to use things. Science is simply a tool. And so I don't think you can say, the truth is science will be used for both. I mean, science has been used to solve problems, but also supersize problems. I think if you're in the trenches in 1917, I think the invention of the machine gun probably supersized your problem. It didn't actually solve it. But in other contexts, technology can be great.
Right. All right. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Dr. Nicholson, for taking the time, and we'll hope to perhaps see each other again in future events.
For sure.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you so much.